Imagine checking your email on an ordinary Tuesday and discovering someone took out a $750,000 mortgage in your name. Now imagine discovering that someone was your own parents. That's exactly what happened to me. For 30 years, I'd been the responsible daughter, the one who never caused trouble, who always had her life together, who bailed everyone else out of their messes. I was the family backbone, the eternal safety net, the dependable one, and they repaid my lifetime of loyalty by committing fraud against me. When I confronted them about forging my signature on a $750,000 house that my brother was living in, do you know what they said? "It's just paperwork, Sarah. It's not like you're actually paying anything." Just paperwork. $750,000 of debt attached to my name, my credit score, my future, reduced to just paperwork. My family thought they knew me. They thought they knew exactly how I would react. With hurt feelings, sure, but ultimately with forgiveness. With understanding. With the same silent acceptance I'd always offered when they took advantage of my reliability. What they didn't expect was for the doormat to finally stand up. What they never saw coming was for the family pushover to push back. And they certainly never imagined that I would smile as I signed the foreclosure papers that would change all our lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Now let's dive into how a single email notification shattered everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and my own strength. Growing up as Sarah Mitchell meant growing up in someone else's shadow. My brother Ryan was the family star. Charismatic, ambitious, and perpetually in some kind of trouble that everyone rushed to fix. From his teenage years when my parents drained their savings to pay for the neighbor's car he'd wrecked, to his 20s when his sure-thing business ventures consumed my father's retirement fund, Ryan's needs always came first. I learned early that my role was to be the counterbalance, the steady one, the one who didn't make waves. "Thank goodness for Sarah," my mother would sigh after another Ryan catastrophe. "At least one of our children has her head screwed on straight." It wasn't a compliment, it was an assignment. While Ryan received unconditional support regardless of his choices, I earned conditional approval based on how useful I could be to the family unit. I paid my way through college with scholarships and part-time jobs. I became a high school English teacher, not glamorous but stable. I built an immaculate credit score, paid off my modest car loan early, and saved for a down payment on a home of my own someday. My parents never asked how I was doing financially. They assumed I was fine. After all, I was the responsible one. The one who had it all figured out. The one who didn't need help. The truth was more complicated, of course. I didn't have it all figured out. I had simply learned to solve my problems quietly, to manage my struggles privately, to never add my burdens to the family load already heavy with Ryan's constant crises. My apartment in Cedar Heights wasn't much, a one-bedroom on the third floor of a converted Victorian house, with uneven floors and temperamental plumbing. But it was mine. Paid for with my teacher's salary, decorated with secondhand furniture and plants I'd nurtured from cuttings. It wasn't impressive, but it was honest. Everything in my life had been earned, not given or taken. That Tuesday started like any other. September in Morton Valley meant crisp mornings and golden afternoons, students settling into the rhythm of a new school year. I'd spent my lunch break grading essays in the teacher's lounge, half listening to my colleagues debate the merits of the new standardized testing requirements. When my phone chimed with an email notification, I almost ignored it. Almost. But some small voice, intuition perhaps, or self-preservation, made me glance down at the screen. Quarterly mortgage statement. $750,000 property at 1482 Lakeview Drive, Morton Valley. I stared at it, certain it was spam or a phishing attempt. I had no mortgage. I lived in an apartment. And Lakeview Drive? That was the affluent lakeside community on the other side of town where homes started at half. $1 million. Still, something cold settled in my stomach as I clicked open the email. There was my name, Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell, my social security number, my date of birth, all attached to a mortgage I'd never taken out for a property I'd never seen. "You okay, Sarah? You look like you've seen a ghost." Karen from the math department peered at me over her reading glasses. "Fine," I managed, gathering my papers. Just remembered something I forgot to do. I retreated to the empty classroom and called the number listed on the statement with shaking fingers. As the phone rang, memories flickered through my mind. Ryan's sudden upgrade from his cramped condo to a new place 18 months ago. The housewarming party I'd attended briefly, admiring the lakefront views while Ryan barely acknowledged my congratulatory card. My mother's strange comment as we stood in the gleaming kitchen. Isn't it wonderful when families help each other achieve their dreams? At the time, I'd assumed he'd received another bailout from our parents. It never occurred to me that I was the unwitting sponsor of my brother's luxury lifestyle. Pacific Coast Mortgage. This is Danielle speaking. How can I assist you today? "Hello," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "I'm calling about a mortgage statement I received for a property on Lakeview Drive. My name is Sarah Mitchell." "Of course, Ms. Mitchell. Let me pull up your account." The cheerful clacking of computer keys. "Yes, I see you here. It looks like you're currently 3 months behind on payments. We've sent several notices to the address on file." The room seemed to tilt sideways. "There's been a mistake. I never took out this mortgage. I don't own this property." A pause. "According to our records, the mortgage was originated 18 months ago. All paperwork appears to be in order, with your signature on all required documents." 18 months ago. That timeline matched perfectly with Ryan's move. The realization crashed over me like ice water. My brother wasn't living in a house that our parents had helped him buy. He was living in a house that someone had bought using my identity. "I need copies of all the paperwork," I said, my voice now hollow. "This isn't right. I never signed anything." "I understand your concern," Danielle said, her tone shifting to something more cautious. "I can have copies of the documentation sent to the email address we have on file. Is that still current?" I confirmed my email address, thanked her mechanically, and ended the call. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The final bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, but I remained at my desk, staring unseeing at the stack of ungraded papers before me. It had to be a mistake, some kind of clerical error or mix-up. But even as I tried to convince myself of this, a deeper truth was taking root. One that connected too many dots, explained too many oddities from the past year and a half. The way my mother had dodged my questions about how Ryan could afford such a nice place right after that mess with the gambling debts. The strange comment from my father when I'd admired the view. Well, everyone deserves nice things sometimes, don't they? Even Ryan. The way Ryan had seemed almost guilty when showing me around, rushing through the tour, changing the subject whenever I asked about the financing. By the time I left school that day, the shock had begun to solidify into something harder, colder. I drove to my apartment on autopilot, pulled into my usual parking spot, and sat motionless behind the wheel for several long minutes. Then I did something I'd never done before. I called my parents and lied. "Mom, I'm not feeling well. I don't think I can make it to dinner on Sunday." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm sorry to hear that." My mother's voice held genuine concern. She wasn't a monster. None of them were. That's what made the betrayal so complex. "Can I bring you some soup? I'm making a batch tomorrow anyway." "No thanks. I just need rest." "Well, if you change your mind." "Oh, did Ryan call you? He's got big news about a promotion at work. We're going to celebrate this weekend." Always Ryan. Always his victories, his needs, his celebrations. Even now, when I'd called about being sick, the conversation had pivoted to my brother within 30 seconds. "That's great," I said flatly. "Tell him congratulations from me." After hanging up, I walked into my apartment and did something else I'd never done before. I poured myself a generous glass of wine at 4:30 on a weekday, sat down at my small kitchen table, and began to plan how I would respond to what was increasingly, undeniably clear. My family had committed fraud against me. They had stolen my identity, leveraged my perfect credit score, and saddled me with a debt that could destroy my future. And they had done it without a second thought. The email from Pacific Coast Mortgage arrived while I was on my second glass of wine. Attached were PDFs of the mortgage application, approval documents, and closing paperwork. Dozens of pages of legal jargon and financial figures that made my head swim. But what caught my eye immediately, what made my blood run cold, were the signatures scattered throughout the documents. My name, over and over again. Sarah Elizabeth Mitchell. Except it wasn't my handwriting. It was close. Clearly someone had practiced, had made an effort to mimic the way I formed my letters. But it wasn't mine. The S looped too dramatically. The cross on the T was too long. My real signature was smaller, tighter, with a distinctive tilt that was entirely absent from these forgeries. Someone who knew me, who had access to my personal documents, had studied my signature and duplicated it multiple times on paperwork for a $750,000 mortgage. There were only 3 people in the world who had that kind of access to my personal information. My mother, who had helped me organize my files after college, insisting on keeping copies of my important documents, just in case. My father, who had prepared my taxes every year until recently, claiming it was easier to keep my financial information with theirs. And Ryan, who had stayed in my apartment for 2 weeks when his condo was being treated for mold, who had unlimited access to my desk, my filing cabinet, my personal papers. I scrolled through the documents with growing horror. The mortgage was in my name only. The property tax bills were sent to my parents' address, listed as my primary residence in the paperwork. The income verification showed a salary 3 times what I actually made as a teacher, with supplemental consulting income I'd never earned. It was fraud, plain and simple, identity theft, criminal actions taken by the people who were supposed to love me most in the world. And they'd done it for Ryan. Again. I closed my laptop and pressed the heels of my palms against my eyes, fighting back tears that threatened to spill over. Crying wouldn't solve anything. Crying was what the old Sarah would do. Hurt, confused, but ultimately willing to sweep everything under the rug to maintain family peace. But as I sat there in my modest apartment that I'd worked so hard for, surrounded by the life I'd built honestly, something shifted inside me. A lifetime of being the family doormat, of putting everyone else's needs before my own, of making myself smaller to accommodate Ryan's largeness. It all crystallized into a solid core of resolve. This time would be different. This time, I wouldn't smile and nod and find ways to justify their actions. This time, I would protect myself, even if it meant blowing up every family dynamic I'd spent 30 years maintaining. I pulled out my phone and searched for identity theft lawyer near me. Then I poured myself a 3rd glass of wine, something else the old Sarah would never do, and began writing down every memory, every comment, every strange interaction from the past 18 months that suddenly made terrible, perfect sense. By midnight, I had 5 pages of notes, a consultation appointment with a lawyer specializing in identity fraud, and a clarity I'd never experienced before. The fear and shock hadn't disappeared, but they'd been joined by something new: determination. I slept fitfully that night, dreaming of drowning in paperwork while my family watched from the safety of a gleaming lakeside deck. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I woke with the same resolve that had carried me to sleep: There would be no more sacrificing myself to solve problems I didn't create. At school, I moved through my day like an automaton, teaching lessons on the Great Gatsby, while my mind churned with thoughts of fraud and betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Discussing Fitzgerald's exploration of the corruption behind the American dream, while my own family had corrupted my financial future to support my brother's facade of success. During my planning period, I called the county records office and confirmed what I already suspected. The deed to 1482 Lakeview Drive was in my name only, transferred 18 months ago. I made an appointment to view the original paperwork in person the following afternoon. Next, I called my bank and instructed them to require in-person verification for any new accounts, loans, or credit applications. I placed fraud alerts on my credit reports. I changed all my online banking passwords and security questions. Small actions, perhaps, but each one felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. After school, I drove past the Lakeview property, something I hadn't done since the housewarming party. It was even more impressive in the clear afternoon light. Sprawling lawn sloping down to the lake, multi-level deck with built-in hot tub, 3-car garage housing Ryan's SUV, and the speedboat he'd apparently acquired since I'd last visited. A life of luxury, purchased with my stolen identity. I didn't stop. I didn't get out of the car. I simply drove past slowly, taking in the magnitude of what had been done in my name, without my knowledge or consent. That evening, my mother called again. "Sarah, honey, are you feeling any better? We really want you at the celebration dinner on Sunday. Ryan specifically asked if you'd be there." I doubted that very much. Ryan and I had never been close, a distance that had only grown in adulthood. But I recognized the manipulation tactic, making me feel wanted, needed, included in something important. "I should be fine by then," I lied smoothly. "What time should I come over?" 6 o'clock. I'm making Ryan's favorite, prime rib. Of course she was. Always the favorite foods, the favorite child, the favorite celebration. "Sounds great. Can I bring anything?" "Just yourself, sweetheart." "Oh, and maybe that chocolate cake you made for Easter?" Ryan loved it. 3 mentions of Ryan in a 30-second conversation. Some things never changed. "Sure, Mom. I'll see you Sunday." I ended the call and returned to the notes I'd been compiling, questions for my lawyer, documentation of the fraud, a timeline of events leading to this moment. Working methodically gave me a sense of control that had been stripped away by the shock of the mortgage discovery. The next day after school, I met with the lawyer I'd found, Nadia Patel, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for handling identity theft cases with brutal efficiency. Her office was small but impeccably organized, walls lined with diplomas and professional certifications. "Walk me through what you've discovered," she instructed after preliminary introductions. I laid out everything: the mortgage notification, the forged signatures, the property I'd never purchased, the brother living in a home fraudulently obtained in my name. Ms. Patel took notes, asking occasional clarifying questions. When I finished, she set down her pen and looked at me directly. "This is a clear case of identity theft and mortgage fraud," she said without preamble. "The fact that it was perpetrated by family members doesn't change the legal ramifications, but it does complicate the emotional aspects." She tilted her head slightly. "Many victims in your situation decide not to pursue legal action against family members. Is that something you're considering?" The question gave me pause. Until that moment, I hadn't fully articulated to myself what I wanted to happen. Did I want my parents charged with fraud? Did I want Ryan evicted from the lakeside home? Was I prepared to potentially send my own family members to jail? "I want my name removed from the mortgage," I said finally. "I want my credit restored. I want to be protected from any further financial impact of their actions." Ms. Patel nodded. "All reasonable goals and completely achievable. If criminal Charges are the only way to accomplish that. Then that's what I want to pursue. There are multiple paths we could take, she explained. We can work with the mortgage company directly, presenting evidence of the fraud. We can file civil charges, seeking damages and relief. Or we can pursue criminal charges of identity theft and fraud, which would involve the police and potentially result in criminal records or even incarceration for the perpetrators. The word incarceration hung in the air between us, my own parents, my brother, behind bars. I need to think about which approach I want to take, I said. Of course. Ms. Patel handed me her card. In the meantime, I recommend gathering as much documentation as possible. Bank statements showing your actual income, proof of residence, at your apartment, examples of your genuine signature, anything that demonstrates you couldn't and wouldn't have taken out this mortgage. I nodded, tucking the card into my wallet. And Ms. Mitchell? She added as I stood to leave. One more piece of advice, if I may. Don't confront your family until we have a legal strategy in place. People who have committed fraud often panic when discovered. They may destroy evidence, create false narratives, or pressure you emotionally to drop the matter. It's better to have everything prepared before they know you're taking action. Her words sent a chill through me, not because they were threatening, but because they were so rational, so practical. Advice for dealing with criminals, not family. But that was the reality I now faced. The people I had trusted most had committed a crime against me. A crime that could have destroyed my financial future, my credit, my ability to ever own a real home of my own. I understand, I said. I won't say anything yet. As I drove home from Ms. Patel's office, a strange calm settled over me. The initial shock and hurt had transformed into something cooler, more focused. This wasn't about family drama anymore. It wasn't about feeling betrayed or undervalued or used. It was about justice. It was about consequences. It was about finally standing up for myself after a lifetime of lying down so others could step over me. Sunday's celebration dinner loomed in my mind, not as something to dread, but as an opportunity to observe, to gather information, to see my family through new eyes now that the blinders of loyalty had been ripped away. For the next 2 days, I continued building my case. I pulled credit reports showing my actual financial history. I gathered pay, stubs proving my teacher's salary couldn't possibly qualify for a $750,000 mortgage. I collected samples of my genuine signature from various legal documents, highlighting the differences between my authentic handwriting and the forgeries on the mortgage paperwork. I also did something I'd never done before. I researched my brother's financial history. Public records showed tax liens from the IRS dating back 5 years, civil judgments from creditors, a bankruptcy filing 3 years ago that should have made it impossible for him to qualify for any significant loan in his own name. The picture that emerged was damning. Ryan hadn't just made a few financial mistakes. He had systematically lived beyond his means for years, accumulating debt he never intended to repay, burning bridges with creditors, and always finding someone else to bail him out when the consequences threatened to catch up with him. Until 18 months ago, when apparently even our parents couldn't solve his financial problems legally, when they'd crossed the line into fraud, using my identity, my credit, my future as collateral for his continued lifestyle of irresponsibility. By Sunday morning, I had compiled a comprehensive dossier documenting the fraud and its implications. I had scheduled a follow-up appointment with Ms. Patel for Monday afternoon. I had made my decision about how to proceed legally. And I had baked the chocolate cake my mother had requested, a small, ordinary act that felt strangely subversive given what I now knew. As I carefully frosted the layers, I wondered how many more normal family interactions we would have before everything imploded. How many more dinners and phone calls and text messages before the truth shattered the careful facade we'd all maintained for decades. I arrived at my parents' suburban home at exactly 6 o'clock. cake balanced carefully, in one hand as I rang the doorbell. The same door I'd walked through hundreds of times throughout my life. The same house where I'd grown up, always slightly in Ryan's shadow, always the reliable counterweight to his chaos. My mother answered, beaming with the practiced warmth she'd perfected over 30 years of playing family peacekeeper. "Sarah, you're looking much better. Come in, come in. Your father's just opening wine and Ryan's already here." I stepped into the familiar entryway, handed over the cake, and steeled myself for what might be the last normal family dinner we would ever share. What they didn't know, couldn't possibly comprehend, was that the dutiful, compliant daughter they'd taken for granted had finally reached her breaking point. That beneath my polite smile and casual conversation, I was already drafting the legal documents that would force them to face the consequences of their actions. That the foreclosure process was already mapped out in my mind, step by methodical step. That for the first time in my life, I was choosing myself over family obligation. And that choice would change everything. The dining room looked exactly as it always had. The same faded floral wallpaper my mother refused to update. The same china cabinet displaying wedding gifts they'd received 35 years ago. The same family photos arranged chronologically along the far wall. Ryan's football trophies still commanded the highest shelf in the living room, visible from where I sat at the table. My academic awards had never made it out of storage boxes in the attic. "So," my father said, raising his wine glass, "to Ryan's promotion, regional sales manager after only 2 years with the company. That's my boy." Ryan grinned, accepting the praise as his birthright. He looked good. Expensive haircut, designer watch, the confident posture of someone whose path had always been smoothed by others' efforts. My brother had mastered the art of failing upward, his charm and our parents' support ensuring that no mistake ever carried lasting consequences. Until now. "Thanks, Dad," he said, taking a satisfied sip of his wine. "It's been a long road, but I finally feel like everything's coming together." I studied him over the rim of my own glass. Did he think about me when he unlocked the front door of that lakeside house each evening? Did he ever pause to consider what would happen when the fraud was discovered? Or had he simply assumed, like always, that someone else would handle the fallout? "The salary bump is sweet," Ryan continued, helping himself to another slice of prime rib. "And the company car is being delivered next week. No more car payments for me." My mother beamed. "That's wonderful, honey. You deserve it after everything you've been through." Everything he'd been through. As if his financial disasters were hurricanes that had struck randomly rather than consequences of his own choices. "How about you, Sarah?" My father turned to me, an afterthought. "How's school going?" "Fine," I replied, cutting my meat into precise pieces. "We're studying The Great Gatsby right now." "That's nice," my mother said vaguely, already turning back to Ryan. "Tell us more about the company retreat in Aspen. Will Rachel be going too?" Rachel was Ryan's latest girlfriend, a personal trainer he'd met at his gym. I'd heard she had recently moved into the lakeside house, my house according to the mortgage documents. I wondered if she knew her new home was built on fraud. Dinner continued in its predictable pattern. Ryan dominated the conversation with stories of workplace triumphs and expensive purchases. My parents hung on every word, offering encouragement and admiration. I was occasionally acknowledged with questions about my much less exciting teacher's life. My responses met with distracted nods before attention swung back to the family star. It was a dynamic I'd lived with my entire life, but tonight I saw it with new clarity. This wasn't just annoying family favoritism. This was the exact mindset that had made it possible for them to commit fraud against me. The absolute certainty that Ryan's desires outweighed my rights. That his comfort was worth my security. That I existed primarily as a resource to be tapped when needed. "Oh, Sarah made your favorite chocolate cake for dessert," my mother announced as she cleared the dinner plates. Ryan's eyes lit up. You didn't have to do that, sis. It was no trouble, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. I know how much you enjoy it. My mother disappeared into the kitchen and returned with the cake I'd spent 3 hours perfecting that morning. As she set it on the table, I wondered if this would be the moment, if I would crack and confront them, derailing my carefully constructed legal strategy with an emotional outburst. Instead, I watched my father cut generous slices, distributing them around the table with practiced motions. I accepted mine with a polite smile. I listened to Ryan rave about the rich frosting. I answered my mother's questions about the recipe. And all the while, I thought about the documents waiting in Ms. Patel's office, about the fraud alert I'd placed on my credit, about the future that was rightfully mine, now weighted with debt I never agreed to carry. Sarah's been quiet tonight, my father observed, glancing at me between bites of cake. Everything okay, kiddo? The old nickname grated. I wasn't a child to be patted on the head and dismissed. I was a 30-year-old woman whose identity had been stolen by the people, sitting around this very table. Just tired, I lied. End of the quarter is always busy with grading. My mother nodded sympathetically. Teaching is such demanding work. I don't know how you do it, day after day with those teenagers. It's rewarding, I said simply. Still, Ryan interjected, you could probably make more money doing something else. With your brains, you could be in finance or tech, something that actually pays decent money. The irony was almost unbearable. My brother, living in a house fraudulently obtained using my credit, suggesting I find a better-paying job. I like teaching, I replied. Ryan shrugged. To each their own, I guess. But man, that lakefront property market is exploding right now. My place has appreciated almost 20% since I bought it. You should think about investing instead of just sitting on your savings. Real estate is where it's at. My father nodded approvingly. Ryan's right about that. Property is always a smart move. I set down my fork, the cake suddenly tasteless in my mouth. How exactly did you afford that house, Ryan? Last I knew, you were underwater on your condo and dealing with the fallout from your investment in that cryptocurrency scheme. A sudden silence fell over the table. My mother's eyes widened slightly. My father stared down at his plate. Ryan shifted in his chair, the first flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Things turned around. He said vaguely. Made some good moves, had some help. You know how it goes. Help, I repeated, the word hanging in the air between us. My mother jumped in, her voice artificially bright. More cake, anyone? Or I could make coffee. I should get going, I said, rising from my chair. Early day tomorrow. But you just got here, my mother protested. We've barely had a chance to catch up. I smiled thinly. We'll have plenty of time to talk soon, I'm sure of it. The drive home from my parents' house had never felt so long. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension as suburban streets gave way to the older neighborhood where my apartment building stood. The evening had confirmed what I already knew. There would be no easy resolution, no sudden confession or tearful apology. They believed they were entitled to use my identity, my credit, my future as a resource for Ryan's benefit. The realization settled like ice in my stomach. This was never going to change. The patterns were too deeply entrenched, the roles too firmly established. I would always be the reliable backdrop against which Ryan's drama played out, the solid foundation they all stood upon without acknowledgement or gratitude, unless I changed it. The next morning, I called in sick to work, something I almost never did, and met with Ms. Patel at her office. I had made my decision. I want to pursue all available legal remedies, I told her, sitting straight-backed, in the chair across from her desk. I want my name removed from the mortgage. I want my credit restored, and I want them to face consequences for what they've done. Ms. Patel nodded, her expression revealing neither approval nor judgment. We'll need to start by filing a police report for identity theft. That establishes the official record of the crime and will be necessary for dealing with credit bureaus and the mortgage company. A police report, I repeated. The words felt surreal. Reporting my own parents to the authorities. Yes, after that, we'll file a formal dispute with the mortgage company, including all the evidence we've gathered showing you didn't apply for or sign the loan documents. We'll also file formal identity theft reports with the credit bureaus to begin restoring your credit. What happens to the house? I asked. To my brother? If the mortgage company accepts that the loan was fraudulently obtained using your identity, they'll likely begin foreclosure proceedings. Your brother would be required to vacate the property, and whoever actually took out the fraudulent mortgage, presumably your parents, could face criminal charges for identity theft, forgery, and mortgage fraud. Criminal charges. My parents. In court. Possible jail time. Is there any way to resolve this without criminal charges? I asked, a last flicker of the old family peacekeeper surfacing. Ms. Patel leaned forward slightly. Ms. Mitchell, I understand this is difficult, but what your family did wasn't a misunderstanding or a gray area. It was deliberate fraud involving a substantial amount of money. They committed multiple felonies, created extensive false documentation, and did so knowing it could devastate your financial future if they defaulted on the payments. She was right. This wasn't about hurt feelings or family squabbles. This was about crimes committed against me by people who should have protected me. I understand, I said quietly. Let's proceed with the police report. The Morton Valley Police Station smelled of coffee and industrial cleaner. I sat across from Officer Daniels, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, as he took my statement about the identity theft. I handed over copies of the mortgage documents, highlighting the forged signatures, and explained how I had discovered the fraud. "And you're certain these signatures aren't yours?" he asked, examining the paperwork. "Positive. I never signed any of these documents. I never applied for this mortgage. I never purchased this property. And you believe your parents and brother are responsible?" I swallowed hard. "Yes. The property is currently occupied by my brother. The mortgage payments, when they're made, come from an account belonging to my parents. The paperwork lists their address as my primary residence, though I've lived in my apartment for 5 years." Officer Daniels nodded, making notes in his report. "Identity theft by family members is more common than people realize," he said, his tone softening slightly. "It's complicated because the perpetrators have easy access to personal information and documents, and there's often an emotional component that makes victims reluctant to report." "I'm not reluctant," I said, more firmly than I felt. "What they did was wrong. It was criminal. And I want it addressed." He nodded approvingly. "We'll investigate fully. You can expect follow-up from our financial crimes unit within a few days. In the meantime, I recommend not discussing this with the alleged perpetrators. It could give them an opportunity to destroy evidence or coordinate stories." I left the police station with a copy of the report clutched in my hand, official documentation of the betrayal that had shattered my trust in the people I'd loved most in the world. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of legal proceedings and paperwork. Ms. Patel filed formal complaints with the credit bureaus and initiated the process of disputing the fraudulent mortgage. The police financial crimes unit interviewed me, twice more, gathering additional details about the timeline of events and my family's access to my personal information. Through it all, I maintained my normal routine as much as possible. I taught my classes, graded papers, attended faculty meetings. I declined my mother's invitation to another Sunday dinner, citing work obligations. I didn't answer Ryan's text about borrowing my camping equipment for a weekend trip with friends. I was buying time, following Ms. Patel's advice to maintain normalcy until all the legal mechanisms were in motion. It wasn't easy. Each day that passed with them, unaware of what was coming, felt like another lie, another betrayal. But I reminded myself that they had lied to me for 18 months about the mortgage. They had betrayed me far more significantly than I was now betraying them. The call came on a Thursday afternoon during my planning period. Detective Garcia from the Financial Crimes Unit, his voice professionally neutral. "Ms. Mitchell, I wanted to update you on our investigation. We've interviewed the loan officer who processed the mortgage application. He's positively identified your father as the person who accompanied you to the closing. Actually, your mother using your identification. We've also traced the original down payment to your parents' account. The evidence supports your claim of identity theft and fraud." I closed my classroom door for privacy, my heart pounding. What happens now? "We'll be bringing your parents in for questioning tomorrow morning. Given the evidence we've collected, formal charges are likely to follow. Mortgage fraud is a serious offense, Ms. Mitchell. The district attorney will make the final determination. But cases involving this amount of money typically result in criminal prosecution. Criminal prosecution, my parents in court, perhaps in jail." "I understand," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "One more thing," Detective Garcia added. "Once we question your parents, they'll be aware of the investigation. They may attempt to contact you, possibly to pressure you into dropping the charges or changing your statement. You're not obligated to speak with them. And in fact, we recommend limiting contact until the legal process is complete." After hanging up, I sat at my desk, staring unseeing at the stack of essays waiting to be graded. Tomorrow, my parents would be questioned by police. Tomorrow, they would learn that their dutiful daughter had reported them for fraud. Tomorrow, everything would change. That night, I barely slept. I kept imagining the moment when they would realize what was happening. My father's shock, my mother's tears, the frantic calls they would almost certainly make to me, begging for explanation, for forgiveness, for mercy. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would remain firm, yet calm in the face of their inevitable emotional onslaught. But all my preparation couldn't have readied me for the reality that arrived the next day. I was in the middle of teaching The Great Gatsby to my junior English class when my classroom phone rang. The school secretary's voice was apologetic. "Sarah, there's an urgent call for you in the office. Your mother says it's an emergency." It had begun. I asked my teaching assistant to continue the discussion and walked with measured steps to the main office, each footfall feeling heavier than the last. The secretary handed me the phone with a sympathetic smile, assuming this was a routine family matter. "Hello?" I said, my voice remarkably steady. "How could you?" My mother's voice was raw, tear-soaked, almost unrecognizable. "The police were here this morning, Sarah. They're saying we committed fraud. They're saying you reported us. Your own family." I closed my eyes briefly, centering myself. "You did commit fraud, Mom. You stole my identity to get a mortgage for Ryan's house." "It wasn't stealing," she cried. "It was helping your brother when he needed it most. We were going to tell you eventually, once he was back on his feet financially. You forged my signature on legal documents. You lied about my income. You put me on the hook for $750,000 of debt without my knowledge or consent. We've been making the payments," she protested. "You weren't affected at all." "Until you missed 3 months of payments," I countered. "Until my credit score tanked. Until I found out my family thought so little of me that they would risk my financial future without even asking." "Your father could go to jail, Sarah. Is that what you want? For your parents to go to jail because we tried to help your brother?" There it was again. The assumption that Ryan's needs automatically outweighed mine. That supporting him justified any action no matter how harmful to me. "What I wanted," I said quietly, "was for my family to respect me enough to ask before using my identity. What I wanted was to not have my future mortgaged without my consent. "We are your family," she said, her voice hardening. "Family helps family. We raised you better than this." Better than what, Mom? Better than expecting honesty? Better than believing my own parents wouldn't commit crimes against me? "You need to fix this," she demanded. "Call off the police. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding." It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was fraud. And I'm not calling off anything. There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end of the line. My mother had clearly expected me to cave, to apologize, to rush to protect the family as I always had. "If you do this," she said finally, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "if you let them charge us, let them take Ryan's house, you're not the daughter I raised. You're not the person I thought you were." A strange calm settled over me. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm finally the person I should have been all along, someone who values herself enough to say no to being used. I hung up the phone before she could respond and turned to find the school secretary watching me with concerned eyes. "Everything okay?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "No, but it will be." The calls continued throughout the day. My father, alternating between anger and pleading. Ryan, furious that his comfortable life was being disrupted. Even my aunt and uncle recruited to pressure me into dropping the charges. I let most go to voicemail. The few I answered ended similarly to the conversation with my mother, with shock that I wasn't immediately capitulating to family pressure. By evening, I was emotionally exhausted but resolute. I sat on my small balcony with a glass of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. My phone had finally stopped ringing. Either they had given up for the night, or more likely, they were regrouping, planning a new strategy to make me withdraw the police report. As darkness fell, headlights swept across my apartment building. A car door slammed. Footsteps pounded up the stairs to my third-floor unit, then pounding on my door, hard enough to rattle the hinges. "Sarah, open the door!" "I know you're in there." Ryan's voice, slurred with what I assumed was alcohol, echoed through the hallway. I remained seated on the balcony, making no move to answer. "You can't do this to me," he shouted. "It's my house, my life you're ruining. All because you're jealous that I finally have something nice, and you're stuck in this crappy apartment teaching snot-nosed kids." More pounding. A neighbor's door opened and closed quickly, someone deciding this wasn't their problem to solve. "Mom and Dad were just trying to help me, and now they might go to jail. Is that what you want? Your own parents in jail because poor little Sarah didn't get asked permission?" His words were designed to wound, to trigger the lifetime of conditioning that had taught me to prioritize his needs above my own. But they fell strangely flat, unable to penetrate the armor of resolve I'd built over the past weeks. Eventually, the pounding stopped. I heard him kick the door once more in frustration, then stomp back down the stairs. His car engine revved, aggressively as he peeled out of the parking lot. I took another sip of wine, surprised by my own calm. The old Sarah would have been in tears, racked with guilt, already calling the police to withdraw the report, that Sarah no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, clearer, unwilling to sacrifice herself on the altar of family obligation. The next morning, Ms. Patel called with an update. The mortgage company had completed its investigation and confirmed the fraud. They would be removing my name from the loan and initiating foreclosure proceedings on the property. They're also cooperating fully with the police investigation, she added. This strengthens the criminal case against your parents. What happens next? I asked. The district attorney will decide whether to file formal charges, which seems likely given the evidence. Your parents will be arrested, booked, and arraigned. They'll have the opportunity to post bail pending trial. And my brother? Unless we can prove he was knowingly involved in the fraud, rather than just benefiting from it, he's not criminally liable. However, He will lose the house once foreclosure is complete. I thought about Ryan's rage the night before, his sense of entitlement, so profound that he saw himself as the victim rather than me. "How long will all this take?" I asked. "The criminal proceedings could take months, possibly longer if your parents fight the charges. The foreclosure will move more quickly, probably 60 to 90 days. I thanked her and hung up, feeling strangely hollow. Everything was proceeding exactly as I'd wanted. My name being cleared, my credit being restored, consequences being faced by those who had wronged me. Yet there was no satisfaction, no triumph, only a deep sadness for what had been irreparably broken. The arrest came 3 days later. My parents were taken into custody on charges of identity theft, forgery, and mortgage fraud. They were released the same day on bail, pending trial. The local newspaper ran a small article about the case, respected local couple charged with defrauding their own daughter. My father's accounting firm placed him on administrative leave. My mother's friends at the garden club suddenly had scheduling conflicts when she tried to maintain her normal activities. Ryan was forced to move out of the lakeside house as the foreclosure process began. He found a small apartment across town, and from what I heard through mutual acquaintances, was telling anyone who would listen that I was a vindictive, ungrateful sister who had turned on her family out of pure spite. I ignored it all as best I could, focusing on my teaching, on rebuilding my life, on moving forward. I changed my phone number, blocking my family from direct contact. I started seeing a therapist to work through the complex emotions of setting boundaries with people who had never respected them before. For nearly 2 months, I existed in this strange limbo, legally vindicated but emotionally adrift. The mortgage had been removed from my credit reports. The foreclosure was proceeding without my involvement. My parents were awaiting trial, having rejected a plea deal that would have reduced their potential sentences in exchange for admitting guilt. Then, on a rainy Tuesday almost identical to the one when I'd first discovered the fraud, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find my mother standing in the hallway, rain dripping from her coat, her face pale and drawn in a way I'd never seen before. "May I come in?" she asked quietly. Every instinct warned against it, against exposing myself to more manipulation, more guilt trips, more emotional blackmail. But something in her demeanor, a new weariness that had replaced her usual confident authority, made me step aside. She entered cautiously, as if expecting to be ejected at any moment. I gestured toward the small living room, and she sat perched on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You've lost weight," she observed, her eyes taking in the changes 2 months had wrought in me. "So have you," I replied. A heavy silence fell between us, 30 years of unspoken truths pressing down like a physical weight. "Why are you here, Mom?" I finally asked. She took a deep breath, seeming to gather her courage. "I wanted to tell you that your father and I have decided to change our plea to guilty." This was unexpected. They had been vehemently proclaiming their innocence to anyone who would listen, insisting that their actions were justified by family necessity. "What changed your minds?" "Reality," she said simply. "The evidence is overwhelming. Our lawyer says fighting the charges would likely result in harsher sentences." She paused, then added in a softer voice, "And I've had time to think about what we did, really think about it from your perspective." I said nothing, waiting. "We were wrong, Sarah." The words seemed to cost her tremendous effort. "Not just legally wrong, morally wrong. We violated your trust. We put Ryan's wants ahead of your basic rights. We treated you like a resource instead of a person." Tears filled her eyes. But unlike during our phone confrontation, these seemed genuine rather than manipulative. "I'm not here to ask you to forgive us or to withdraw the charges. I know that's not possible now." She wiped her eyes with a tissue pulled from her purse. "I just wanted you to know that I understand now why you did what you did, and you were right to do it." the admission stunned me. Never in my entire life had I heard my mother acknowledge that she was wrong about anything substantial, especially where Ryan was concerned. "Dad feels the same way?" I asked skeptically, a flash of the old defensiveness quickly suppressed. "He's getting there. It's harder for him to admit he made a mistake this serious, but he agreed to the guilty plea, which is a start." "And Ryan?" Her face fell. "Ryan still believes we were justified in helping him, that families should stick together no matter what. He doesn't understand why you couldn't just look the other way." Of course he didn't. A lifetime of being the family priority had built an impenetrable wall of entitlement around my brother. "We're selling the house in Brookside to pay for legal fees and restitution," she continued. "We'll probably have to move into an apartment. After..." She trailed off, unable to say the words. "After prison," I finished for her. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I never imagined my life would come to this, that I could make choices that would lead here. I thought about all the small choices that had built to this moment. My parents deciding that Ryan's needs always came first. Me accepting the role of family afterthought. All of us playing our assigned parts in a dysfunctional dynamic that had finally, inevitably, collapsed under its own weight. "I'm not glad you're going to prison," I said honestly. "I never wanted that. I just wanted to protect myself from the consequences of what you did." "I know that now." She hesitated, then asked, "Will we ever have any kind of relationship again? After everything is done?" It was the question I'd been asking myself for months. Could I forgive the unforgivable? Could I rebuild a relationship on such broken foundations? "I don't know," I answered truthfully. "Maybe someday, but it would have to be something completely different from what we had before. I won't go back to being the person who always sacrifices for everyone else." She nodded, slowly accepting this as fair. "For what it's worth, I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself, even though it was against us." A sad smile touched her lips. Maybe especially because it was against us. When she left an hour later, nothing had been resolved. The legal proceedings would continue. My parents would likely serve time for their crimes. Ryan would continue blaming me for his problems. But something had shifted. A first tentative step toward a truth we had all been avoiding for decades. As I closed the door behind her, I felt a strange lightness. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace. I had finally broken the patterns that had defined my entire life. I had finally said no to being used and taken for granted. I had finally chosen myself. Part 3. The guilty plea changed everything and nothing. My parents accepted a deal that included 6 months in minimum security prison for my father, 3 months for my mother, followed by 3 years probation for both. They would pay restitution for all costs associated with the fraudulent mortgage. They would attend financial counseling and ethics training as part of their rehabilitation. The local newspaper ran another small article. Their friends and colleagues drifted away, uncomfortable with the messy reality of respectable people who had committed serious crimes. Their comfortable upper-middle-class life imploded around them, leaving behind only the harsh consequences of choices they had never expected to face. Ryan refused to speak to me. According to my mother, he blamed me entirely for the family's downfall, unable to recognize his own role in the disaster. He had moved in with a friend temporarily while searching for an apartment he could afford, on his actual income, now that the financial cushion my parents had always provided was gone. As for me, I continued teaching, continued seeing my therapist, continued rebuilding my life on more honest foundations. The fraud alerts remained on my credit reports, a precaution against any future attempts to use my identity. I changed all my financial passwords and security questions, no longer using family-related information that could be easily guessed. Small steps toward security. Small acts of self-protection that I should have implemented years ago. Spring arrived, the academic year winding toward its conclusion. My father began serving his sentence at a minimum security facility 2 hours away. My mother prepared for her own incarceration, scheduled to begin after my father's release so that one of them would always be available for family matters. Family matters. As if we were still a functioning unit rather than scattered fragments of what had once been a cohesive whole. I didn't visit my father in prison. The wound was still too raw, the betrayal too profound. But I did exchange occasional letters with my mother, cautious communications that skirted the deepest issues while acknowledging that something had irrevocably changed between us. "I've been thinking a lot about how we raised you and Ryan," she wrote in one letter. "How differently we treated you. We thought we were doing what was best for both of you, giving Ryan the extra support he seemed to need, trusting you to succeed on your own. But we never asked if that's what either of you actually needed or wanted. We just assigned you roles and expected you to play them forever." It was more insight than I had ever heard from her before. Perhaps the looming reality of incarceration had forced a level of reflection she had previously avoided. In another letter, "Your father struggles to discuss what happened. He still believes on some level that he was justified because he was protecting his son. But he also acknowledges that he hurt his daughter in the process, and that realization is painful for him to confront." I read these letters with a strange detachment, as if they described people I had once known rather than the parents who had raised me. The emotional distance was a form of self-preservation, a buffer against the complicated grief of losing a family not to death, but to their own actions and my necessary response. Summer arrived, bringing with it a sense of possibility I hadn't experienced in years. My credit was fully restored. The foreclosure on the lakeside property was complete. The legal proceedings against my parents were settled. For the first time in my adult life, I was truly free from the family dynamic that had constrained me for so long. I decided to use part of my summer break to travel, something I had always wanted to do but had never prioritized. A 3-week trip to Europe, visiting places I had only read about in books or seen in movies. Paris, Rome, Barcelona, Vienna. Cities filled with history and beauty and all the experiences I had denied myself while being the dependable daughter, the reliable counterweight to Ryan's chaos. It was during my second week sitting at a small cafe in Rome watching sunset paint ancient buildings in gold and amber that I finally felt something inside me release. The constant tension I had carried for months, years really, eased, allowing me to breathe fully for perhaps the first time in my adult life. I wasn't responsible for fixing my parents' mistakes. I wasn't obligated to sacrifice my future for Ryan's comfort. I wasn't required to set myself on fire to keep others warm. I was just Sarah Mitchell, 30 years old, sitting in a beautiful city as the sun set, free to make whatever choices would lead to my own happiness and fulfillment. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. When I returned home, in late July, tanned and more relaxed than I had been in years, I found a letter waiting from Ryan. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened. What could he possibly say that I needed to hear? But curiosity won out, and I slit the envelope carefully, bracing myself for more anger, more blame, more entitlement. Instead, I found something unexpected. "Sarah," the letter began in Ryan's familiar scrawl. "I'm writing this from my new apartment. It's small and nothing special, but I'm paying for it myself with money I actually earned. No loans, no handouts, no fraud. Just honest work and living within my means for the first time in my life." I sat down at my kitchen table, surprised by the direction this was taking. "I've been angry at you for months. Furious, actually. I blamed you for everything. Losing the house, Mom and Dad's legal troubles, my suddenly having to support myself completely. I told myself you were selfish and vindictive, that you could have just ignored the mortgage situation and everything would have been fine. Typical Ryan, I thought, always seeing himself as the victim. But something happened last week that changed my perspective. I applied for a car loan. Nothing fancy, just reliable transportation to get to work. And I was denied. My credit score is terrible from years of late payments and maxed out cards. No one will lend to me without a cosigner. I could see where this was going, a sick feeling growing in my stomach. My first thought was to ask Mom to cosign when she gets out, but then I realized that's exactly how this whole mess started. Me expecting other people to put their financial security on the line for my benefit. Me thinking I was entitled to things I hadn't earned. The letter continued for several pages, Ryan walking through his gradual realization that the family dynamic hadn't just harmed me, it had crippled him as well, preventing him from developing the skills and responsibility he needed to function as an independent adult. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he wrote toward the end. "I'm not even asking for a relationship right now. I just wanted you to know that I'm starting to understand what you did and why you did it. And while I wish it could have happened differently, I can see now that it probably needed to happen exactly this way for any of us to change." He signed it simply, Ryan, followed by a PS. "I'm in therapy too now. Turns out being the golden child messes you up almost as much as being the forgotten one." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, unsure how to feel about this unexpected development. Was it genuine insight or another manipulation? Had Ryan truly begun to recognize his role in the family dysfunction? Or was this another strategy to regain access to my life and resources? Time would tell, I supposed. In the meantime, I had my own life to focus on. The new school year began, bringing fresh classes of students eager to discuss literature and develop their writing skills. I threw myself into teaching with renewed energy, no longer carrying the constant weight of family obligation. The courthouse loomed ahead, all granite and glass, as I walked up the wide steps. My attorney, Ms. Patel, walked beside me, her briefcase swinging slightly with each step. The morning air held the first hints of autumn, crisp and clear, carrying the scent of nearby coffee shops and the promise of change. Inside my chest, a strange calm had replaced the storm of emotions that had defined the past weeks. Today, my parents would formally enter their guilty pleas. Today, the legal process that had consumed my life would begin its final chapter. "Remember," Ms. Patel said quietly as we approached the imposing entrance, "you don't have to make any statements. Unless you want to. The prosecutor may ask if you wish to address the court regarding the impact of the crime, but it's entirely your choice." I nodded, grateful for her steady presence. The massive doors swung open, revealing the controlled chaos of a county courthouse. Security, lines, hushed conversations, the soft rustle of paperwork changing hands. We passed through metal detectors and made our way to courtroom C, where a small crowd had already gathered. My heart stuttered when I spotted them. My parents, seated in the front row beside their attorney. My father looked diminished somehow, his usual confident posture replaced by a slight hunch of the shoulders. My mother stared straight ahead, her profile rigid with what I recognized as tightly controlled fear. They didn't see me enter, or perhaps they were deliberately avoiding looking around. Ms. Patel and I took seats on the opposite side of the courtroom, a physical representation of where we now stood, adversaries in a legal battle that had once been a family. "All rise," the bailiff called moments later, and the judge entered, a silver-haired woman with sharp eyes and an expression that suggested she had seen every possible human drama unfold in her courtroom. The proceedings began with formalities. Case, numbers, charges read aloud, legal terminology that transformed the intimate betrayal of family into the sterile language of criminal law, identity theft, forgery, mortgage fraud, Class C felonies carrying maximum sentences of 5 years imprisonment and fines up to $125,000. When asked for their pleas, my parents stood together, their voices barely audible as they each said, "Guilty, Your Honor." The prosecutor outlined the plea agreement they had negotiated, reduced sentences in exchange for full admission of guilt, complete cooperation, and restitution. My father would serve 6 months in minimum security, my mother 3. Both would face 3 years of probation after release, mandatory financial counseling, and strict limitations on their ability to engage in financial activities. "Does the victim wish to make an impact statement at this time?" the judge asked, her gaze finding me in the gallery. Ms. Patel glanced at me questioningly. We had discussed this possibility, prepared remarks in case I wanted to speak. But now, seeing my parents standing small and defeated before the court, the carefully crafted statement seemed unnecessary. The legal system was working as intended. Justice, cold and impersonal, but justice nonetheless, was being served. "No, Your Honor," I said, my voice stronger than I expected. The judge nodded, then turned her attention back to my parents. "The court accepts the plea agreement as outlined. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell, I want to be very clear about the seriousness of your actions. You committed crimes not against a stranger, but against your own daughter, violating the trust that should be foundational to family relationships. While the court recognizes your lack of prior criminal history and cooperation with authorities as mitigating factors, I find the betrayal of family trust to be particularly disturbing." My mother's shoulders trembled visibly. My father stared at the floor. "You will report to the county corrections facility on the date specified in your sentencing documents. Failure to appear will result in additional charges. This court is adjourned." The sharp crack of the gavel punctuated the end of the hearing. People began to rise, gather belongings, move toward the exits. My parents turned slowly, and for the first time that day, our eyes met across the courtroom. My mother made a small movement, as if to approach me, but their attorney placed a restraining hand on her arm, murmuring something I couldn't hear. They were shepherded toward a side door, disappearing from view without a word exchanged between us. Outside on the courthouse steps, reporters waited with cameras and microphones, the local news apparently having decided that respectable middle-class parents committing financial fraud against their daughter was noteworthy enough to cover. Ms. Patel fielded their questions efficiently. Ms. Mitchell is satisfied with the resolution of this case and is focused on moving forward with her life. She asks for privacy during this difficult time. We escape to her car, leaving the journalists calling questions behind us. As we pulled away from the courthouse, I watched the imposing building recede in the side mirror. "How are you feeling?" Ms. Patel asked after several minutes of silence. I considered the question carefully. "Empty," I said finally. Like I should feel something more definite, satisfaction or grief or anger, but there's just this hollow space. She nodded understandingly. "That's not uncommon in cases like this. The legal resolution doesn't automatically heal the emotional wounds. That part takes more time. Time. The one thing I now had in abundance, stretching before me like an open road. Time to rebuild, to redefine, to discover who Sarah Mitchell was when not constrained by family obligations and expectations." My father reported to the county corrections facility the following Monday, a low-security installation that resembled a community college campus more than a prison. My mother would begin her shorter sentence after his release, an arrangement designed to ensure one parent remained available for family responsibilities, though what those might be now was unclear to me. I returned to my classroom, to the routine of teaching literature to teenagers who knew nothing of the private earthquake that had shattered my family foundations. The familiarity was comforting, discussing Fitzgerald's exploration of the hollow American dream, guiding students through the complexities of Shakespeare's character motivations, celebrating small victories when reluctant readers finally connected with a text. Weekends stretched emptily before me, no longer punctuated by obligatory family dinners or last-minute requests to help with Ryan's latest crisis. I filled the new space with activities I'd always wanted to pursue but never prioritized. A pottery class at the community center, hiking trails in the state park just outside town, volunteer work at the local animal shelter where I found myself, increasingly drawn to a one-eyed tabby cat named Winston. "He's been here 3 months," the shelter manager told me one Saturday as I sat cross-legged on the floor, Winston purring in my lap. "Most people want kittens or the pretty ones. Nobody seems to want a middle-aged cat with battle scars." I scratched behind his remaining ear, feeling his rumbling purr vibrate against my fingertips. "Sometimes the ones with scars have the most to offer," I said quietly. 2 weeks later, Winston came home with me, adapting to apartment living. With the pragmatic flexibility of a creature who had known harder times, he claimed the sunniest windowsill, established a nightly routine of sleeping curled against my side, and provided silent companionship as I navigated my new reality. The first letter from my father arrived 6 weeks into his sentence, the envelope marked with the corrections facility stamp. I let it sit unopened on my kitchen counter for 3 days, unsure whether I wanted to read whatever justifications or excuses it might contain. Eventually, curiosity won out. Inside was a single page, the handwriting I recognized from decades, of birthday cards and school permission slips now seeming smaller, less certain. "Dear Sarah," it began. "I've started this letter 100 times in my head, but no opening seems adequate for the conversation we need to have. I'm sorry. Feels insulting in its insufficiency. How does one apologize for betraying their child's trust so completely? What words could possibly bridge the gulf I've created between us?" I paused, surprised by the lack of defensiveness that had characterized his responses since the fraud discovery. The thing about prison, even this minimum security version, is that it strips away pretenses. I can't hide behind my reputation here, behind the facade of the successful accountant and family provider. I'm just inmate for 47291, a man who committed fraud against his own daughter because he couldn't face the truth about his son. I continued reading, the letter detailing my father's gradual recognition of the dysfunctional family dynamic he had helped create, the unequal treatment of his children, the enabling of Ryan's irresponsibility, the taking for granted of my reliability. I justified it all as parenting differently based on each child's needs. But the truth I'm finally facing is that we weren't responding to who you and Ryan actually were. We were casting you in roles that served our own narrative. Ryan as the struggling son who needed constant rescue. You as the self-sufficient daughter who didn't need anything from us. We never stopped to question whether these roles were fair or even accurate. The letter continued for several pages, more honest self-reflection than I had ever heard from my father. He wrote about the shame of having his professional colleagues learn of his crimes, the humiliation of being imprisoned, the painful recognition that his own actions had destroyed the family he had believed himself to be protecting. "I don't expect forgiveness," he concluded. "I'm not even asking for it. What I did was unforgivable, a violation of the most basic trust between parent and child. I just wanted you to know that I understand now what I did to you, and I am genuinely, deeply sorry." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to its envelope, uncertain how to feel about this unexpected vulnerability from a man who had always prided himself on emotional stoicism. Was it genuine remorse or the convenient regret of someone facing consequences? Was it the beginning of real change or a temporary insight that would fade once normal life resumed? I didn't write back immediately. Instead, I took the letter to my therapist, Dr. Winters, at our next session. "What do you make of this?" I asked, handing it to her after explaining its origins. She read it carefully, her expression thoughtful. "What's your gut reaction?" she asked when she finished. I considered the question. "Confusion," I admitted. Part of me wants to believe he's genuinely recognized how wrong their actions were. Another part suspects this is just another manipulation, that he's saying what he thinks I want to hear, to rebuild a relationship he now realizes has practical value to him. Dr. Winters nodded. Both are valid interpretations based on your history with him. The real question might be, what do you want from this relationship moving forward, assuming his remorse is genuine? It was a question I had been avoiding, focusing instead on the legal proceedings and the practical matters of rebuilding my credit and financial security. What did I want from my relationship with my parents now? Could there even be a relationship after such a profound breach of trust? I don't know, I said honestly. I can't imagine ever trusting them completely again. But the idea of having no family at all feels empty. Those aren't the only two options, Dr. Winters pointed out. Relationships exist on a spectrum. Perhaps somewhere between complete trust and total estrangement, there's a limited relationship with clear boundaries and expectations. I left. The session with that possibility turning in my mind, not the complete restoration of what was lost, but perhaps the careful construction of something new, something healthier that acknowledged the past without being defined by it. Eventually, I wrote back to my father, a short note acknowledging receipt of his letter, expressing neither forgiveness nor continued anger, but simply recognition of his perspective. It felt like the first tentative step on a long, uncertain road that might lead to reconciliation or might simply provide closure. Either outcome would require time and work from all involved. My mother's letters came more frequently, less introspective than my father's, but increasingly honest about her role in the family dysfunction. She wrote about her preparations for her own incarceration, scheduled to begin when my father was released in January. She described the sale of their home to pay legal fees and restitution, the downsizing to a small apartment, the disappearance of friends who couldn't reconcile their image of her with the reality of her crimes. It's strange. She wrote in one letter, how quickly a life built over decades can unravel. Everything I thought defined me, my home, my social circle, my reputation in the community, gone in the space of months. I'm left wondering who I am without those external markers of identity. It was a question I understood intimately, having undergone my own identity reformation since discovering the fraud. Who was I when not defined by my role as the reliable daughter, the family safety net? Who was I when acting from self-respect rather than habitual self-sacrifice? The answers were emerging slowly. A Sarah who took pottery classes and adopted one-eyed cats, who hiked on weekends and sometimes invited colleagues over for dinner parties, who set boundaries and honored her own needs without guilt. A Sarah who was learning, step by careful step, to trust her own judgment above others' expectations. Ryan remained the wild card in the family equation. After his initial fury at my legal action, he had retreated into silence, refusing to respond to the few tentative messages I sent checking on his welfare. According to my mother, he had found an apartment within his means and a job that covered his basic expenses, but was struggling to adjust to life without the financial cushion our parents had always provided. Part of me worried about him. 32. Years of sibling connection couldn't be erased entirely, regardless of recent events. But another part recognized that his journey was his own responsibility now. I could no longer be the family fixer, the one who smoothed Ryan's path at the expense of my own welfare. As autumn deepened into winter, bringing holiday decorations to neighborhood windows and festive displays to storefronts, I faced another new reality. My first holiday season without family gatherings. No Christmas Eve at my parents' house, no New Year's Day brunch where Ryan would arrive late and hungover, but still receive the choicest portions of my mother's special quiche. The prospect was both liberating and lonely. I found myself accepting invitations I might have declined in previous years. Thanksgiving with my department chair and her wife, a holiday concert with friends from my pottery class, a New Year's party hosted by neighbors in my apartment building. small celebrations with people who knew me as I was now, not as the person I had been obligated to be within my family system. On Christmas morning, I woke to Winston's rumbling purr beside my ear and a quiet apartment bathed in winter sunlight. No presents to unwrap. I had exchanged gifts with friends at earlier gatherings, but a day stretching before me with no obligations, no performances required, no role to fulfill except the one I chose for myself. I made coffee, strong and black, the way I preferred it rather than the milky, sweetened version my mother always served at family gatherings. I read for pleasure, losing myself in a novel I'd been saving for a quiet moment. I took a long walk through the park near my apartment, admiring how frost transformed ordinary landscapes into temporary works of art. And in the evening, I did something I had never done before. I booked a summer trip to Italy, a place I had always wanted to visit but had never prioritized over family obligations and financial commitments to help with Ryan's endless emergencies. 3 weeks exploring Rome, Florence, Venice, and the Tuscan countryside, a gift to myself funded by the savings I had accumulated since cutting financial ties with my family. As I completed the reservation and watched the confirmation email appear in my inbox, a sense of possibility unfurled within me. The realization that this was just the beginning of a life shaped by my own choices, my own desires, my own priorities. The painful catalyst that had set me on this path was not what I would have chosen, but the direction it had ultimately pointed me was one of unexpected freedom. My father was released from the corrections facility in early January, just as my mother prepared to begin her own shorter sentence. The local newspaper ran a small follow-up article, noting the transition and rehashing the original crime in brief, impersonal paragraphs. A neighbor showed it to me, unaware of my connection to the story, commenting on how shocking it was that people like that could commit fraud against their own daughter. "You never really know people, do you?" she remarked, shaking her head. "I mean, who does that to their own child?" I murmured something non-committal and changed the subject, unwilling to reveal my identity as the victim in this now public scandal. The story had taken on a life of its own in our small community, becoming a cautionary tale, a piece of local gossip, a convenient reminder that appearances could be deceiving. The real people involved, their complex motivations, their genuine regrets, their ongoing struggles to rebuild, were flattened into simplified characters in a morality play. My father called the day after his release, his voice hesitant, asking if I would be willing to meet with him. I agreed to coffee at a neutral location, a small cafe downtown where we were unlikely to encounter anyone either of us knew well. When I arrived, he was already seated at a corner table, hands wrapped around a mug as if seeking warmth. The 6 months of incarceration had aged him visibly. His hair seemed grayer, the lines around his eyes deeper, his shoulders carrying a permanent slouch that hadn't been there before. When he saw me, he started to rise, then stopped himself, uncertain of the protocol for greeting a daughter you had betrayed. I slid into the seat opposite him, ordering tea from the hovering waitress before turning my attention to the man who had once been the center of my childhood world. "You look well," he said finally, breaking the awkward silence. "I am well," I replied, neither warm nor cold, simply factual. "Sarah, he began, then stopped, seeming to struggle for words. "Everything I've rehearsed saying seems inadequate." I waited, offering neither encouragement nor discouragement. This was his moment to fill, his opportunity to demonstrate whether the insights expressed in his letters had translated into genuine change. "I destroyed something precious," he said finally, his voice low. "Not just your credit or your financial security, which were serious enough, but your trust, your belief that your parents would protect rather than exploit you, your sense of safety within your own family." He looked up, meeting my eyes directly for the first time. "And I can never fully repair that damage no matter how much I might want to." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to me. Not an excuse, not a justification, not a plea for understanding. Just a simple acknowledgement of the irreparable harm he had caused. "No," I agreed quietly. "You can't." He nodded, accepting this truth without argument. The question then becomes whether there's anything that can be built in its place. Something different. Something that acknowledges what happened without, pretending it didn't fundamentally change everything between us. I sipped my tea, considering his words. What would that look like to you? "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "I've never had to rebuild a relationship from such complete betrayal before, but I imagine it would start with me accepting full responsibility, without qualifications or excuses, with respecting whatever boundaries you need to feel safe, with proving through consistent actions over time that I've truly changed my understanding of my obligations to both my children." Both children. The reference to Ryan hung in the air between us. "Have you seen him?" I asked. A flash of pain crossed my father's face. "Yes, he's struggling. Not just financially, though that's part of it, but with his understanding of himself, his place in the world. Everything came so easily to him for so long, not because of any inherent superiority I now realize, but because your mother and I smoothed his path at every opportunity. Now he's facing genuine consequences for perhaps the first time, and he doesn't have the emotional tools to process that reality." "And you're not rushing to fix it for him?" I couldn't keep the skepticism from my voice. "No," he said simply. "I'm not. Partly because I no longer have the resources to do so, but mostly because I finally recognize that my help has actually been harm in disguise. Ryan needs to develop his own competence, his own resilience. Things we systematically prevented by constantly rescuing him." It was a perspective shift I hadn't expected, an acknowledgement not just of the harm done to me, but of the more subtle damage done to Ryan through years of enabling and differential treatment. "He blames me," I said. "For everything, the house, your imprisonment, his sudden need to support himself." My father nodded. "He does, or he did. I think reality is beginning to break through that narrative, but it's a painful process for him. 32 years of being the family golden child doesn't disappear overnight." We talked for nearly 2 hours, the conversation moving from the specific harms of the mortgage fraud to the broader patterns of our family dynamic over decades. There were no dramatic apologies, no tearful reconciliations, no promises of immediate restoration. Just 2 adults examining the broken pieces of a relationship and considering whether something worthwhile could be salvaged from the wreckage. When we parted, my father didn't ask when we might meet again, didn't press for commitments or reassurances. He simply thanked me for coming, expressed hope that I would stay in touch if and when I felt comfortable doing so, and walked away with the slightly stooped posture of a man carrying the full weight of his own actions. I watched him go, feeling neither the burning anger that had fueled my initial legal response, nor the reflexive forgiveness that had characterized so many of my previous interactions with family. Instead, I felt something new, a calm assessment of reality as it was, not as I wished it might be. A recognition that rebuilding trust, if possible at all, would be a long and uncertain process requiring genuine change from all involved. And for perhaps the first time, I felt genuinely okay with that uncertainty. Whatever happened with my family, whether we eventually forged a new, healthier relationship or permanently went our separate ways, I now knew I would be all right either way. My worth, my security, my happiness were no longer dependent on their validation or approval. That knowledge, hard-won through painful experience, was perhaps the most valuable outcome of this entire ordeal. Part 4. Spring arrived in a riot. Of color and scent, cherry blossoms dotting the park near my apartment, tulips pushing through soil in neatly maintained beds downtown. I watched the seasonal transformation with new eyes, appreciating the symbolic resonance of renewal after dormancy, growth after necessary pruning. My mother completed her shorter prison sentence and joined my father in the small apartment they now called home. A significant downgrade from their former house, but what they could afford after legal fees and restitution payments had drained their savings. They were adjusting to reduced circumstances with varying degrees of grace, according to the occasional updates I received through brief phone calls and text messages. Our contact remained limited but civil. Holiday greetings, brief conversations about neutral topics, careful avoidance of the painful history that lay between us. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of a new understanding that acknowledged past harm without letting it entirely dictate future possibilities. Ryan was a different story. After months of silence, he appeared unannounced at my classroom door one afternoon in late April, hovering uncertainly in the hallway as my students filed out after the final bell. "Got a minute?" he asked, his voice lacking its usual confident swagger. I gestured him inside, noting the changes 6 months had wrought in his appearance. The designer clothes had been replaced by simpler attire, the expensive haircut grown out, the luxury watch absent from his wrist. He looked ordinary, like someone living within his actual means rather than a carefully maintained facade of success. "You look different," he said, taking in my own transformation. The shorter haircut I'd adopted for ease of care, the comfortable clothes that prioritized my preferences rather than others' expectations, the more confident posture that had developed naturally as I grew into my authentic self. "So do you," I replied. He glanced around my classroom, the literary quotes on the walls, the student projects displayed with pride, the organized chaos of an active learning environment. "Nice room. Looks like your students actually care about what you're teaching." It was perhaps the first genuine compliment he had offered about my career, which he had previously dismissed as a safe, unambitious choice compared to his series of flashier but ultimately unsuccessful ventures. "Most of them do," I agreed. "What brings you here, Ryan?" He shifted uncomfortably, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I've been working with a therapist. Part of the process is making amends where possible. Not expecting forgiveness, just acknowledging harm and taking responsibility." I raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. Ryan taking responsibility was as unexpected as snow in July. "Don't look so shocked," he said with a ghost of his old humor. "Even I can grow up eventually, when all other options are exhausted." "What exactly are you taking responsibility for?" I asked, curious whether his understanding aligned with reality or represented another self-serving narrative. He sighed, leaning against a student desk. "For accepting a house I knew was purchased fraudulently. For benefiting from mom and dad's scheme while ignoring the impact on you. For years of expecting you to pick up the slack whenever I created chaos." He met my eyes directly. "For being so entitled that I actually felt victimized when you protected yourself from what we did to you." It was more insight than I had expected, a level of self-awareness that suggested his therapy was genuinely effective rather than performative. "That's a lot of recognition," I said cautiously. "Yeah, well, it turns out when your entire life implodes and you're finally forced to examine the patterns that led there, some uncomfortable truths become pretty hard to ignore." He offered a rueful smile. "Especially when you can no longer afford the distractions that kept those truths at bay." We talked for nearly an hour, the conversation more honest than any we'd had in our adult lives. Ryan described his struggles adjusting to genuine financial independence, the humbling experience of beginning at entry level in his early 30s, the painful recognition of how his parents' enabling had stunted his development in crucial ways. "I was furious at you for months," he admitted. "Blamed you for everything. Losing the house, mom and dad going to jail, my lifestyle circling the drain. It was easier than facing my own role in all of it." "What changed?" I asked. "Reality," he said simply. Daily, unrelenting reality without the cushion I'd always counted on. And therapy, forcing me to look at patterns I'd spent a lifetime denying. He paused, studying his hands. "And seeing what it's done to Mom and Dad, not just the legal consequences, but the recognition of how badly they failed both of us in different ways. They meant well, I think, but they created a mess that hurt everyone involved." It was the most mature perspective I'd ever heard from my brother, an acknowledgement of the complex reality rather than the simplified narrative of entitlement he'd maintained for so long. "I don't expect us to suddenly be close," he continued. "Too much water under that bridge. But I wanted you to know that I understand now why you did what you did, and you were right to do it." As he prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. "One more thing. I've been saving up. It's not much yet, but I've started a restitution fund to help repay what my actions cost you, beyond the legal settlement. It'll take time, but I'm committed to making it right financially, even if I can never fully repair the relationship." I watched him walk away down the school hallway, feeling a complicated mix of emotions: cautious hope for his apparent growth, lingering wariness born of long experience with his charm and subsequent disappointments, genuine surprise at the concrete steps he was taking toward amends. Time would tell whether this transformation was lasting or another temporary adaptation to circumstances. In the meantime, I would maintain the boundaries that had protected me through the worst of the ordeal, opening them gradually only if consistent evidence of change warranted such trust. As summer approached, bringing the end of the school year and the beginning of my planned Italian adventure, I found myself reflecting on the journey of the past year. From the shock of discovering the mortgage fraud to the painful legal proceedings, from the shattering of family bonds to the tentative exploration of whether and how they might be rebuilt, it had been a transformation more profound than I could have imagined that rainy Tuesday when an unexpected email had changed everything. The Italian trip represented more than just a vacation. It was a declaration of independence, a statement that my time, my resources, and my choices were my own. No longer would I defer dreams to accommodate others' emergencies. No longer would I measure my worth by my usefulness to family members who took that usefulness for granted. 2 days before my departure, I received an unexpected package delivered to my apartment. Inside was a leather-bound travel journal with an inscription on the first page in my mother's familiar handwriting. "For Sarah, as you begin your adventure, may you find joy in discovery, peace in new perspectives, and the freedom to define life on your own terms. With love and profound respect for the woman you've become, not despite our failures, but because you had the courage to overcome them." It wasn't an attempt to reclaim the old relationship. It wasn't a plea for forgiveness. It was simply an acknowledgement of my growth and an expression of support for my journey forward, wherever it might lead. A small gesture that respected my autonomy rather than presuming intimacy that had not yet been rebuilt. I packed the journal alongside my carefully selected travel essentials, uncertain whether I would use it, but appreciating the sentiment behind the gift. Italy exceeded every expectation. Ancient ruins bathed in golden light, Renaissance art that took my breath away, small cafes where I lingered for hours over espresso and conversation with fellow travelers. I lost myself in bustling markets, quiet churches, winding streets leading to unexpected vistas. I savored pasta made by hand that morning, wine produced from nearby vineyards, gelato in flavors I had never imagined. And each evening, somewhat to my surprise, I found myself reaching for the journal, recording not just the sights and experiences, but the internal journey that paralleled the external one. The gradual relaxation of vigilance that had become habitual during the months of legal proceedings. The discovery of preferences and interests I had never fully explored while constrained by family expectations. The emergence of a Sarah Mitchell defined not by relationship to others, but by authentic connection to self. Halfway through the trip, Wandering through a small Tuscan village perched on a hillside, I encountered an elderly artisan creating delicate ceramic pieces in a sun-drenched studio. Something about her work, the clean lines, the harmonious colors, the sense of both strength and fragility, spoke to me on a level beyond words. "You are an artist?" she asked in lightly accented English, noting my intense interest in her technique. "No," I replied automatically. "Just a teacher." She tilted her head, considering me with wise eyes that seemed to see beyond surface presentation. "Why just? Teaching is creation of another kind, and perhaps there are other creations waiting within you." The observation lingered as I continued my journey, sparking a reassessment of possibilities I had never seriously considered. I had taken up pottery as a distraction, a way to fill newly empty hours after cutting ties with family obligations. But perhaps it could be more, not necessarily a career change, but a genuine avenue of creative expression, a part of my identity beyond professional role or family position. When I returned home in mid-July, tanned and refreshed and somehow both more grounded and more expansive than when I'd left, I made two significant decisions. First, I would convert the small second bedroom of my apartment, previously used for storage, into a creative space with a pottery wheel and basic supplies. Second, I would accept the department chair position offered shortly before my departure, stepping into a leadership role I had previously declined due to concerns about time commitment and family obligations. Both decisions represented a new direction, investment in my creative development and professional growth, without reference to how these choices might impact my availability to address family needs or crises. They were choices made from a center of self-knowledge rather than external expectation, and the clarity of that distinction brought a satisfaction I had rarely experienced before. The remainder of summer passed in a blend of preparation for the upcoming school year and exploration of my new creative space. I took advanced pottery classes, developing skills beyond the basics I had learned in community center workshops. I rearranged my living space to better reflect my actual preferences rather than practical compromises. I adopted a second cat, a young female with glossy black fur who approached life with enthusiastic curiosity, a perfect complement to Winston's more reserved temperament. As August drew to a close, bringing with it the familiar rhythms of a new academic year, I received a text message from my father. "Your mother and I are hosting a small gathering for our anniversary. Very casual, just appetizers and conversation. You're welcome to join if you feel comfortable doing so. No pressure either way." The invitation itself represented growth, acknowledging my autonomy, offering connection without demand, respecting that my choice would be based on my own comfort level rather than family obligation. A year ago, such an invitation would have been phrased as an expectation, with attendance assumed and non-appearance treated as betrayal. After consideration, I decided to attend briefly, a step in testing whether limited, boundaried family contact might be possible without falling back into destructive patterns. I arrived 15 minutes after the stated start time, bringing a bottle of wine but no obligation to stay beyond my own comfort level. The apartment my parents now called home was modest but pleasant, decorated simply with a few cherished items, saved from their former residence. 4 other guests were already present, longtime friends who had maintained contact despite the scandal and legal proceedings, demonstrating a loyalty my parents clearly valued. Sarah. My mother's greeting was warm but restrained, respecting the undefined nature of our current relationship. "Thank you for coming." My father simply nodded, his eyes conveying gratitude for my presence without presuming upon it. Ryan was notably absent, a consideration I appreciated given the still fragile state of our tentative reconciliation efforts. The evening proceeded with surprising ease. Conversation focused on neutral topics, memories shared of happier times without glossing over present realities, genuine interest expressed in my Italian travels and new professional responsibilities. There were no dramatic confrontations, No tearful declarations of regret or forgiveness. No pressure to perform familial closeness beyond what felt authentic in the moment. I stayed just over an hour, departing with cordial goodbyes and no promises. Regarding future gatherings, as I drove home through quiet streets, I reflected on the subtle shift that had occurred. Not a restoration of what was lost, but perhaps the beginning of something new. A relationship based on mutual respect rather than reflexive patterns. On chosen connection rather than obligatory contact. Whether this tentative new foundation would support rebuilding over time remained uncertain. 2 years had passed since that ordinary Tuesday when my world shattered and reformed itself. Winston. Stretched across my desk as I drafted the final chapter of my memoir, his single eye watching the cursor move across the screen. The project had begun as therapy, a way to process the betrayal that had destroyed my family, but evolved into something larger, a testament to survival and the painful beauty of reclaiming one's identity. The publisher's acceptance letter sat, framed on my wall, next to photos from my first solo art exhibition and the certificate from my newly earned master's degree in educational leadership. These achievements weren't acts of revenge or attempts to prove my worth to those who had dismissed it. They were simply the natural flowering of a life no longer constrained by others' limitations of who I could be. My phone buzzed with a message from Ryan, a photo of him standing beside a young couple, grinning broadly outside what appeared to be a bank. The caption read, "Just helped my first clients qualify for their mortgage. Legitimately, your financial literacy curriculum is changing lives." He had taken my suggested revisions to his program and expanded it into a full counseling service, specializing in helping people avoid the predatory lending practices that had destroyed his own finances years earlier. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The man who had benefited from mortgage fraud now dedicating his career to ethical financial guidance. The doorbell interrupted my writing. I found my mother standing on my porch, holding a small potted plant with delicate white blooms. "Jasmine," she said simply, "from the cutting you gave me last spring. It finally flowered." We sat on my porch, swing, the one I'd installed after buying this house, my house, purchased with my own credit, in my own name, with signatures that were genuinely mine. The afternoon sun filtered through the oak tree I'd planted the day I moved in, now tall enough to provide real shade. "Your father sends his regards," she said, adjusting the plant on the small table between us. "He's teaching accounting at the community college now. Says his students appreciate learning from someone who understands the real consequences of financial misconduct." My parents had served their sentences with dignity, emerging smaller but somehow more solid. They lived quietly now in a modest duplex across town, tending gardens and volunteering at a legal aid clinic that helped victims of financial crimes. They had never asked for forgiveness, understanding that some bridges, once burned, must be rebuilt from entirely new materials. "Tell him I'm glad," I said, meaning it. We sat in comfortable silence, watching neighborhood children ride bicycles down the street. This new relationship we'd built bore little resemblance to what came before. No pretense of the perfect family, no assigned roles of the responsible daughter and the golden son. Just two adults who had survived a catastrophe of their own making and chosen to construct something honest from the wreckage. "The publisher wants to do a book tour," I said after a while. "Starting in Seattle, then down the West Coast." My mother nodded. "Your story deserves to be heard. Other families need to know that survival is possible, even when trust is shattered by those closest to us." As she prepared to leave, she paused at the porch steps. "I've started my own journal. Nothing for publication. Just trying to understand how I became someone capable of stealing from my own child. How maternal love got so twisted that I thought protecting Ryan meant destroying you. And what have you discovered? That love without respect isn't love at all. It's possession, control, and that the daughter I tried to keep small grew into someone magnificent, not despite what we did, but because she refused to let our limitations define her. After she left, I returned to my writing, crafting the final paragraphs of a story that began with betrayal but refused to end there. Outside my window, the jasmine cutting she'd nurtured to bloom seemed like a perfect metaphor, something beautiful growing from a piece that had been severed, developing its own roots, its own strength, its own capacity to flower. My life now, filled with genuine connections, creative expression, and professional purpose, bore no resemblance to the cramped existence I'd accepted before the fraud forced me to reimagine everything. The price had been steep, the complete destruction of my family as I'd known it. But from those ashes had risen something unexpected, not just survival, but transformation into someone I might never have become without that terrible catalyst. Sometimes the deepest wounds teach us the most valuable lessons. Sometimes the people who claim to love us most show us our worth through their failure to honor it. And sometimes, just sometimes, losing everything we thought we needed shows us what we actually deserve. The cursor blinked on my screen, waiting for the memoir's final words. I typed slowly, deliberately. They stole my identity to buy a house. In fighting to reclaim it, I discovered I had never truly owned it at all. Now, finally, I am home. Not in any building, but in the life I've chosen, the boundaries I've set, and the person I've become. This is my house, these are my walls, and nobody, absolutely nobody, will ever hold the deed but me. I saved the document, closed my laptop, and stepped outside into the garden I'd planted with my own hands. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new growth, new possibilities. But tonight, I was simply Sarah Mitchell, teacher, artist, survivor, finally and completely myself. The jasmine cutting on my table had begun to open its blooms, filling the air with sweetness. Sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the most painful separations. Sometimes being cut away is the only path to truly flourishing. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to discover what you're truly worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.